Thank you so much, Marcia, for that kind introduction. And thanks to the organizers of the conference for having me speak. Could I just get a reminder how long exactly you wanted me to talk?
I believe you're allotted half an hour for your presentation, and then we have discussion for another half hour. So I think you can feel fairly relaxed.
All right, good.
And that wall of books is very
Uh,
beautiful background.
it is virtual. The actual wall of books really is well organized. Well, thank you all for being here. I want to talk today about uh, a set of verses in the Quran, primarily in the Mecca period of the Prophet Muhammad's ministry, roughly 610 to 622 of the Common Era, which deal with, I think, interpersonal issues of peace. And these verses uh, in the literature seem to me not to have been problematized in the way that the sayings of Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, have been the object of a great deal of study and thought. Uh, it's not as common for anyone to gather these up, these verses, which are, I think, the Muslim equivalent of the Sermon on the Mount, and examine them together. So let me bring up my presentation. And I'm really talking about turning the other cheek in Islam. So first thing to say is that the divine is very much wrought up in the Quran with peace. And there is a verse in 59:23 which identifies God himself as peace. So he is God, other than whom there is no God, the King, the Holy, the Peace, As-Salam, the Defender, the Guardian, the Mighty, the Omnipotent, the Supreme. So these are names of God in the Quran. The ones listed here have somehow to do with protecting people. He's the defender, he's the guardian, and that seems and of course the holy, but it seems somehow to be related to peace. And peace in Arabic means not only the lack of conflict, and it does mean that, but also security, well-being, prosperity. And there are thousands of pre-Islamic in rock inscriptions that have a formula in them of wishing peace for the inscriber and asking the deity to provide that kind of peace and security. So the Quran itself and the later Muslim literature about the life of the Prophet depicts him in a situation in Mecca where the Quran began being recited by the Prophet as revelation. It depicts him as encountering opposition. He is preaching a monotheistic message. God is not like anything else. There's only one of him, and it's inappropriate to associate with him in a pantheon any other deities. And so he and his community received taunting, ridicule, and the Meccan chapters of the Quran, they're called surahs, do not speak of violence. If we went by the Quran as our primary source, there doesn't appear to be violence by the pagans toward the Muslims, nor vice versa. In this era, one verse does talk about the pagans plotting to expel the prophet from the city. And so there were severe tensions and at least consideration of rather harsh measures, but the Quran itself does not speak of actual violence. And so it depicts the early believers around the prophet as sitting around, in gatherings with their pagan um, fellow citizens of Mecca, and then sometimes being taunted and harassed, persecuted in various ways, and how to deal with this. So the Quran says in an early chapter, be patient with what they say and take your leave of them graciously. Graciously, literally, here it says beautifully. And then it's in the voice of God, it says, leave the affluent who impugn you to me, giving them a respite. So these are people who are impugning the honesty, the veracity of the early believers and of the prophet. And God instructs them to not reply with any sort of punishment or reprisal, to simply withdraw graciously. And this seems to me to resemble a little bit some of the sentiments in the New Testament. Paul says, "Vengeance is," quotes the Old Testament that "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," and urges the early Christians not to be the agents of that reprisal. There are another set of verses that talk about wishing peace for your enemy. In the 25th chapter, it says, and the servants of the All-Merciful who walk humbly upon the earth, and when the unruly taunt them, they reply, peace. Again, peace here is a prayer. When you, in Arabic, in this era, when you wish peace upon someone, you're asking God to bestow security on them, prosperity, uh, and peace. And so they're being instructed to reply to the word is literally the ignorant, but in classical Arabic, the word has an implication of someone who is lacking in self-discipline and self-control. So the unruly, I translated it here. When the unruly taunt them, they are to reply, peace, peace be upon you. So they're to receive this oral harassment, this social ostracism, this attempt to reduce their status, and to wish peace upon their enemies. And as the Quran goes on, if we follow it according to the Theodor Nöldecke's conception of the ordering of the surahs, which is based in Islamic tradition. And as we get into the middle and later Meccan chapters, the Quran goes beyond simply instructing the believers to withdraw or to wish peace, to actively doing good to the enemy. And so there is in 41:33 through 34, it says, whose discourse is more beautiful than one who summons others to God and performs good deeds and proclaims, I am a monotheist. The word in Arabic here I'm translating as monotheist is Muslim, which does not, in the Quran, does not refer to solely to the community of the prophet, but also to the to any monotheist, to Jews and Christians. The disciples of Jesus say, we are Muslim, and I believe it's properly translated monotheist, or at least that captures some of the sense of it. And then the Quran goes on to say, good and evil are not equal. Repel the latter with the greater good, or possibly the greatest good, and behold, your enemy will become a devoted patron. So the early believers are being instructed to return evil with good. And they're given the hope that in so doing, they will have a transformative effect on their opponents, on their persecutors, and that those persecutors can be, as human beings, uh, reached and transformed and brought into a relationship of patronage and support for the early believers through this ethical response. And this seems to me uh, quite remarkable. And, even in the New Testament, some authors have talked about how the prescriptions for replying to one's enemy are not terribly dialogical. It's all about the internality of the believer, how they should feel about it, and how they should act. But this is dialogical. This is turning the other cheek as a method of ethical transformation of the other. And I think some of these verses of the Quran do have a context in the Christian background of the rise of Islam. Most people in the Eastern Roman Empire had converted to Christianity by the early 600s. Not all. There's evidence, both archaeological and literary, for the survival of small pagan communities at the fringes of the cities among villagers and Bedouin. And of course, that seems to have been the case in Western Arabia, which is substantially beyond the frontier with the Eastern Roman Empire. But most people were by that time some kind of Christian. And the archaeology of Western Arabia does not show inscriptions to the old gods after about 400 of the Common Era. And so for the 200 years before the prophet's ministry, we don't see in the archaeology, according to experts like Christian Robin in Paris, we don't see strong evidence of pagan survival. That paganism is mentioned in the Quran as a literary source, but there are also a few inscriptions in Western Arabia that appear to be Christian. They have a cross scratched onto the rock. And so there seems to be much more Christianity in the background of Islam than the later Muslim tradition, which is quite distant from the Prophet's own lifetime, allows. So there's a verse in the chapter of Al-Qasas, the stories, 28:50 to 57, and it says of a group of Christians who either thought well of the prophet and his message or possibly converted. And it says, these shall be given their wage twice over. That is to say, their wage in heaven, they'll be rewarded double in paradise. These shall be given their wage twice over because they patiently endured and avert evil with good. So again, that returning of evil acts with good ones, and expend of what we have provided them, that is to say, they're generous to the poor. And if they hear abusive speech, they turn away from it and say, to us our deeds and to you your deeds, peace be upon you. We do not want the rowdy. We do not want the unruly. And so this group, which are characterized as having received the revelation before the prophet, are probably Christians. And I think this is a vague reference to some of the values in the New Testament about turning the other cheek. And just to remind us, in the Sermon on the Mount, you have Jesus with the series of antitheses. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye, but I say to you, do not resist the evildoer. And by the way, there's a verse in the Quran which allows for an eye for an eye, but says that it's much more virtuous if the person will forgive the perpetrator of the tort. Um, and you have figures giving you a picture of Saint Maximus the Confessor, who was a contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad. And at the time of the Quran, he produced a work, 400 aphorisms on love. And he addresses some of these New Testament themes about turning the other cheek. Of course, he's very distant from the Quran in time, in space, but not in time. He lived in the Eastern Roman Empire. He was writing in Greek. But I think those Christians that the prophet, that the Quran was praising, may have been monks who were especially devoted to this value of turning the other cheek. So, as I said, here is the verse about the lex talionis. The Quran admits the retribution for a wrong is a wrong the like of it. And remember, that statement is one of proportionality, and it's partially intended to prevent people from going wild and inflicting massive punishment on small slights. And the retribution for a wrong can only be a wrong the like of it. If someone injures you a little, you can't injure them a lot. But then the Quran goes on to say, but God will recompense whoever pardons and makes peace. Surely he does not love wrongdoers. So the early believers around Muhammad were being encouraged also to set aside the eye for the eye and the tooth for the tooth, to go to a deeper and more spiritual response to having been injured. And then there's a remarkable set of verses in chapter 7 of the Quran, 7:19 through 25, which is about the fall of Adam and Eve. And in the Quran, after Satan succeeds in tempting them, and they are expelled from paradise, God's statement to them is descend being enemies to one another. So in the Quran, the immediate aftermath of the fall is not sin in general, but it's violence. It is feuding. And of course, Western Arabia was a region without a central state. And while most people were settled in villages and small towns, there was a significant Bedouin population which lived from raiding and feuding. And although the Bedouin also had ironic relationships with villagers, traded meat and yogurt for grain and so forth, but it was a lawless situation. And so the Quran seems to envisage the aftermath of the fall as like a tribal feud. People fell into division and violence in the aftermath. And then it cautions in a further verse humankind. It says, children of Adam, if messengers come to you from among you relating our verses, whoever fears God and makes peace will have no fear, nor will they sorrow. And in the Quran, there's more than one word for peace, more than one technical term. There's salam, which is, I mentioned, peace, prosperity, security. There's sulah, which typically has to do with making peace, with conciliation. And so as I read these verses, and this is it's eisegesis in a way, it's something that has occurred to me and I haven't seen in the rest of the literature. The fall is a fall into violence, into feuding and discord. And salvation is to be had through the individual believers making peace. Unlike in Christian theology, where the solution of the sin that comes with the fall is the sacrifice of Christ on the cross for the rest of humankind. In the Quran, the resolution is peacemaking, peace work on the part of the post-fall believers. That's where salvation lies. Um, so these early, this early Muslim community or community of believers around Muhammad were praised for wishing peace on those who harassed them. Members of the previous religions are praised for returning evil with good. The believers are instructed to wish peace, to pray for peace, even for the pagans who are their enemies. And the context of this, if I can just back up, is a kind of world war that was raging around the rest of the region beyond Western Arabia. The Iranians and the Eastern Romans had fallen into war. The Iranians invaded the Near East, and for the first time since Rome took Jerusalem, it fell to foreign hands. It fell into Iranian hands in 614 at the time of the Prophet's ministry. This Iranian advance on Rome is mentioned in the Quran. So some of the context of these verses about peace and this attempt to create a community of peacemakers is, I think, that great world war. And so the early community around Muhammad was growing up as an alternative form of society in which there wouldn't be this rapacious and vicious war going on. And one of the reasons that the Quran often gives for instructing the believers not to reply with violence and rather to reply with good to one's persecutors, one of the reasons it's given is that they have no sovereignty. They are not musator, they're not dominant. They're not guardians of somebody else. They don't have a custodial role in society, and that does change. And of course, when the community goes to nearby Medina, having been persecuted and harassed, and the Quran really speaks of them as expelled and losing their homes, their property, becoming refugees in the nearby city of Yathrib or Medina, then they're formed into a sort of polity. And when the pagan Meccans come after them, and clearly with mayhem and murder on their minds, the Quran does allow self-defense. And that's where the verses that are often quoted by the critics of the Quran come in, is those verses are permitting the believers to fight a defensive war. I believe that the Quran does not authorize an aggressive war, but they are authorized to fight a defensive war. And I think one of the differences, I don't believe that the Quran ever abrogates the previous verses having to do with turning the other cheek. I think those are interpersonal instructions and that they remain current. And there's lots of evidence later in the Quran for an attitude of peace seeking and peacemaking. Um, but once there is a polity and it has a kind of legitimacy, I believe the Quran develops a theory of just war. And in this regard, I would just say that the Quran is not different in making this distinction than late antique Christianity. Saint Ambrose, a church father a couple hundred years before the Quran, said that if you see the strong persecute the weak, want to harm or kill women and children, and you do nothing about it, then you're as bad as the aggressor. This is a Christian church father who's approving of violence under certain conditions. And of course, St. Augustine was a cheerleader for the Christian Roman army and justified its wars and nevertheless preached turning the other cheek as a matter of personal ethics. And so I think it was common in the late antique world to make this distinction. I don't think one was seen to abrogate the other. Now there was a tradition in later Islam that Qatada and other exegetes who did have mixed feelings about these peace verses because of the later turn to just war in the Medina period. And there were imperial exegetes who were very keen on promoting even aggressive war, citing these later verses of the Quran, and who didn't want to highlight the earlier ironic verses of the Quran. But I think it's possible for modern scholars to find a frame in which to consider all of them without seeing them as contradictory necessarily. Again, no more contradictory than was common in late antiquity. Finally, let me just say that this talk and the book I wrote, Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires, are all part of a project at the University of Michigan on Islamic peace studies that has resulted in teaching by myself and my colleague Samer Ali, who's co-director of the initiative, and which was funded by the University of Michigan International Institute, and that it's been a wonderful experience with the undergraduates at Michigan to explore peace themes in the Islamic tradition and peace movements in the later tradition as well. And we've had a number of conferences on the subject as well. So I'll leave it there and open.